It's good. And I'm very successful. I mean, I am. I know. They'll finish? Yeah. Well, I think they'll finish ages ago. I know. Do you have a piece of? Oh, yeah. He's got a job now? Is it Google? Yeah, I think Google Maps. Yeah, I know. A lot of my other information about you. 5. You have worked on an 5 different distinct location. Stony Brook, Arizona, yeah, and then the site within, yeah. I just wanted to say something about that. And it's been like 8 different trips. Is that about right? I have no idea. That might be right. How long are you in Netflix?
I had no so I was getting but it's supposed to be pretty bad.
Yeah, the board is supposed to start. The weather on Long Island is so
Well, you know,
always. But we, it ought to be easy because our weather is, they see our weather 2 days in advance.
Last stream.
But Long Island is really job. Being on boats all the time, in the summertime. Tend to not worry about the weather. It's coming at you. Nothing to do. Well, congratulations. Thank you for coming. I'm ready.
no, I didn't do it.
He's a cool kid. What can I say?
I need to see how this all works.
I know.
Yes, so when I keep saying come back. That's
I know the joke.
Well, it's good to meet you. I hear a lot about you.
Same.
You're gonna play that photo for all the work, aren't you?
Looks a lot better than my thermal pictures photographs. No, very high resolution.
I think it's just more. It was long.
It's more.
It's just that, it's a lot.
Photographs are. It's the claw versus the body.
That has to be
Yes, I think that was the case. I was prepared.
That's a more exciting.
Like in the application, they're like, does anybody else already own the media rights to photographs? I know. It's weird. I'm just gonna.
Yeah, well, that's what you think that. Is they got this. It's biodegradable. And they put the atoms in that.
No, it's kind of funny because it's like the optics for them are really good. It's like an optics match. Yeah. They had a huge story in the November issue this month on Antarctica.
In your face when you try to spread it.
Yeah, I needed to come up with you. Yeah, it's just anything. Oh yeah. Oh god, it's 90% of my job. I spent 18 months looking at that story. 18 months. I spent as much time on my own papers, like writing captions and like our data is in the big folder. How are you?
Other than being a little tired,
Yeah.
fine actually.
Yeah, that's good.
But it's I think I slept about 3.5 hours the last 2 days. Well, my flight left San Diego at 10:30 Pacific time last night.
Oh.
I flew all night, so.
I did sort of see that on your face.
Yeah.
I'm not going to think about what this man is doing to get to 15 minutes.
Well, it would have been easy. It would have been easy if you know, I didn't have to really dump those ashes.
Hi, nice to see you again.
You talking to Paul?
This made her go to the bathroom. I didn't actually have to go to the bathroom. I took a video. How are you?
She was asking you for a lot. I said I hadn't checked. First we are a piece of paper. Are you gonna make me give it?
Liliana's the chair.
I'm making this the student.
Oh, what was I supposed to do?
Nothing.
You just say this is.
What you're supposed to have done?
No, it's private.
Okay, what do you want me to say?
This is literally all you have to do.
The rules are that there will be questions from the audience, but not from the committees related to the mission.
We're not typically, but if you didn't even let them know.
I thought they were
I
allowed.
thought you told them they're not allowed.
Oh no, what are the rules? Oh no.
No, okay, you're gonna say the same thing.
And it depends. Anyone has to put in.
I don't know who's watching.
Are you being live
There's
streamed?
4 people. Yeah, my mom and my grandfather, I think.
Well, just, we have to clear up your way.
So I have to do that.
Well, whatever. Yeah, you know, it doesn't usually. It only matters the one conversation.
Hi, everyone. As the chair of Anusha's dissertation committee, it is my pleasure to welcome you to her defense. I will be introducing Professor Catherine Graham in a moment, but before that, I want to emphasize that there are some rules. The rules are that the committee may not ask questions. There will be questions at the end, so you have to wait for your questions until the end of the talk. And the committee will be saving their questions for the closed door session. However, if you're not part of the committee, please feel free to save your questions till the end of the presentation. And now I will introduce Professor Catherine Graham, who will introduce Anusha.
Wow, this is such an exciting day. So I have one quick story about Anusha, which I told her I would tell. No, this is the one. This is the one. Of all the stories. Oh, there's so many stories. But just to sort of paint the picture. So the first day of 5:50, my new student doesn't show up in class. I'm like, man, there must be something wrong. Like, who does that? And so the next day she's in my office. Now that I know like her normal color, I really realized how gray she was in my office that morning. She shows up quite gray. She's like, I'm really sorry I wasn't there. I'm like, oh, what's wrong? What happened? She's like, well, I had, what was it? A kidney stone yesterday. And yesterday I was in the hospital with my kidney stone. And I'm like, that's kind of painful, isn't it? Like, what are you doing here? She's like, but I'm so excited to start. I'm so excited that I'm here. And I was like, wow, I certainly got a winner of a student. She's like, one day in the hospital, the next day in my office. So clearly is highly motivated to do a graduate degree. And that was the case. Anusha's study was one of the more ambitious studies of sort of field physiology in hummingbirds that's been done, as you'll see in a few minutes. And she did it all in South America, and things don't always work exactly the way you expect them to in other countries. And so there was lots of challenges, and she, I think, got more and more creative and more ingenious about how she solved these to actually get some really special data, both in Arizona and in Ecuador. And she'll tell you about that in a few minutes. And I also want to acknowledge who really is her co-advisor, Don Powers. And so we've very much shared the joy of mentoring Anusha. And we were just counting out, Don and Anusha have been like hanging out like for extended periods of time in 5 different places, including different places in North America, in the field, in Ecuador, and in Switzerland. So he's been an amazing co-advisor. And Anusha is going on to better things. She has a 1.5 years worth of postdoc at the University of Alaska in Fairbanks with somebody called Dr. Corey Williams. And she has 2 projects there, which she can tell you more about. Ground squirrels and their hibernation, and then grass rats and their seasonal affective disorder. So she'll be going on to do a couple more physiology projects in different systems in Alaska starting in January. So that's fantastic. So without further ado, I would like to present Anusha.
Thank you all so much for coming, and thank you, Catherine, for the introduction. She did promise me, like the day after the kidney stone, that this would be that story she was telling at the end at the defense. So that is what happened. I just want to point out that I'll have slide numbers on the bottom left of the slide. So if you have any questions, then you can note the slide number and refer to them later. I'm going to be telling you about my work over the past 6 years about how hummingbirds manage their daily energy budgets. Hummingbirds are really small and they spend energy really quickly. They have very high metabolic rates and they barely have any room to store fat as a backup store if anything goes wrong. To illustrate how high their metabolic rates are, they use energy so quickly. So if an average human, a Matt Damon, who's about 84 kilograms, needs about 15 packets of Lay's chips a day to survive, the same human, if they had the metabolic rate or the energy consumption rates of an elephant, would need only 4 packets. And if they were a hummingbird, they would need 600 packets of Lay's chips a day. So hummingbirds are using energy so quickly per unit of their body mass. And most of this comes from nectar from flowering plants. So that's just sugar water, and that's where they're getting all this energy they need from. They feed from hundreds of plants in North and South America, and they are incredibly able to live in such a diversity of habitats despite living on this razor's edge of energy all the time. So they live in the tropical cloud forests in Ecuador, where I've done some of my fieldwork. They live in the high Andes in South America. They also live in the deserts of Arizona. They migrate all the way up to Alaska sometimes. So they lead such incredible lives in terms of how much energy they need and how much on the edge they always are. So they sometimes sometimes the temperatures in these habitats can go, like at this site that I was at, they can go from 0 to 40 degrees Celsius in a single day. So they're also exposed to a really variable set of climatic conditions, and they're able to manage their energy despite all of these really variable situations. They also, you'd think that there would be a few of them who would be able to do this, but there's over 330 species of hummingbirds that live in North and South America, going from the tiniest one, the little bee hummingbird that weighs less than a dime, to the giant hummingbird, Patagonia gigas, which is about 9 dimes stacked together. So this is one of the species, this is the species that we have here. It's only this big. If you doubled its body mass, which is what it does when it migrates, it will become this size. So they're really small. So I'm going to be talking to you about the paradox of the hummingbird. How does it exist? What energy management strategies does it use to get through every day? The first component of this I'll be talking to you about is their allometry. Do they have an unusually high slope, as has been found in the past, compared to other birds? The second is about their daily energy expenditure. Do they change how much energy they use in a day, or is it fixed? The third is, what do they do all day? It's been thought in the past that they are probably perching for most of their day. They're just sitting and resting, but I'll be evaluating whether that's the case. And the fourth is their nighttime energy expenditure. So they use a strategy called torpor, which has been known for a very long time. I'll be talking about what that is. But do they use it all the time? It's kind of a nighttime hibernation. Are they just using that all the time to survive the nights? And with these questions, I'm able to tackle these ideas across multiple scales across species, within species, and between individuals and as well. So the first question on the daily allometry. daily energy expenditure allometry. So it's been found in the past that they have an unusually high slope, and I'll be assessing that. I'll just give you a little bit of a history of allometry. I know that there's some non-biologists here. So people used to think in the early 1800s that there must be some universal rule governing how much energy an animal needs. And as animals get bigger and bigger, they do need more and more energy, but they probably get more efficient and they need less energy per unit of their body mass. So there used to be this idea that there must be some universal slope to this relationship, that all species must scale with a slope of 0.75. And this was the idea from the early 1800s all the way through the mid 1900s. But then people started separating these group-wise, collecting more and more data, and they found that field metabolic rates, or how much energy you need in a day in the field, scales with body mass with different slopes for different groups. So they found that, I'll tell you what the slopes are in the next slide. So if you have a plot of energy expenditure versus mass, these are log-log plots. What does it mean, for example, to have a slope of 1? So if you increase a unit of energy expenditure, you increase a unit, if you increase in a unit of mass across species, you increase in 1 unit of energy expenditure. And that's what a slope of 1 would mean. If you have a lower slope like lizards do, of 0.95, that means that bigger lizards are more efficient per unit gram, or they need less energy per unit gram than smaller lizards. And mammals have an even lower slope, and birds have an even lower slope of 0.67. So a bigger bird is much more efficient per unit mass, or needs less energy per unit mass than a smaller bird. But people have also found that scaling really depends on what you spend energy on. And if you're an endotherm like a bird is, a lot of what you're spending energy on might be just maintaining a constant body temperature and regulating water flux. So these are more surface-related processes, and the exponent is closer to 0.67 or 2/3. But if you're spending energy mostly on muscle activity, those are more volume-related processes, and your scaling is closer to 1. So I'm going to tell you what I found about hummingbirds. They are birds, so you'd expect that their scaling would be 0.67. But previously on hummingbird allometry in the 1990s, it was found that daily energy expenditure, this is a log-log relationship again, scaled with a slope of 1.21. That is higher than 1, which means that bigger hummingbirds are really, they need a lot more energy per unit mass than a smaller hummingbird. And this flies against the face of all scaling kind of relationships. If you scale industries up, if you scale species up, you should get more efficient with increasing size. But hummingbirds are there, so that's really strange. To assess whether this was actually the case, okay, so that would mean, for example, that the giant hummingbird is much more inefficient per unit mass than the little bee hummingbird in Costa Rica. These data were collected across 6 species of hummingbirds. And one of them was an aviary study, which might have restricted kind of how much the hummingbirds could move. So I went to the field and I collected daily energy expenditure data on a variety of hummingbird species. These are some of my field sites. So I went to Arizona, to 2 field sites in Arizona, including this one, where this is a kind of typical landscape of the sites I went to, where they feed on these, I don't know if you can see, these tiny little red flowers in the foreground. So that's kind of what they feed on in this desert landscape. And also to South America, to a few sites in Ecuador, where we have to hike our stuff up on mules, and we get to wake up to these incredible views every morning. And also to the high Ecuadorian Andes at about 3,000 meter elevation, which is where I told you the temperature changes so much every day. And I used this ingenious method called the doubly labeled water method, where you inject or feed the hummingbird a double isotope of water. And so this has deuterium and oxygen 18 mixed in with normal water. You get the hummingbird to feed, and then you allow it to mix with the body's water, and you collect a pee sample. So I became obsessed with hummingbird pee, and you let them go, and then you wait 24 hours and try to get them again. And in that time, they've breathed out carbon dioxide, and they've also been peeing more. So they're losing oxygen in both their pee and their carbon dioxide, but they're losing hydrogen only in their pee. So there's a differential rate of loss of both of these isotopes. So the difference tells you how much carbon dioxide they breathed out in a day. And that turns out to be a really good measure of how much energy you've spent in a day. So we were able to get energy expenditures for a bunch of species in the field, and putting data together from 17 species from the literature and from what I collected, I got this. So this is a plot of daily energy expenditure in kilojoules per day with mass, and the bigger points are species means, and the smaller points are individual level data. And I found that the slope was 0.95. Okay. If we leave out the giant hummingbird, which is often found to be an outlier in these studies of hummingbird hovering and flying, the relationship was, the slope was 0.92, which is, you'll notice, distinctly less than 1. So maybe they're not as, larger birds aren't, hummingbirds aren't as inefficient as we previously thought. And what does it mean? That hummingbirds are lizards? They have exactly the same slope, which is incredible. Let me just put this in the context of the correct intercepts and slopes, because I've just been acting like they all have the same intercepts. Hummingbirds have a slope of 0.92. Lizards have the same slope but a lower intercept. And birds have a higher intercept but a lower slope of 0.67. So I don't know. I spent a lot of time puzzling about why their slope is so high. I mean, I know that they're crazy. They're extreme animals. But I think it all ties back to the plot that I showed you earlier. Scaling depends on what you're spending energy on. And hummingbirds, I think, are spending more energy on average than other birds. So hummingbirds are 25 to 35% muscle. Other birds are only 15% muscle. So a higher proportion of their body mass is muscle than other birds. They also have really high mitochondrial density, so they're using more energy per unit of that muscle than other birds are. Okay, so to go further into this and see whether their behavior was also mapping onto this kind of high energy, high activity relationship, I went on to assess their daily energy expenditure. And the first component is to assess whether daily energy expenditure can change. Is it fixed or is it variable? So to do this, let's just imagine that the amount of energy they spend in a day is like a beaker, and you can change the size of the beaker, so you're spending more and more energy. Can the beaker size change? To assess this, I had 2 field sites in Arizona. One is Harshaw Creek, which is very elevationally and vegetationally diverse. There's a lot of shade where field assistants or hummingbirds can take some rest if it's hot. And Sonoita Creek, which is more flat, less elevationally diverse, and hotter for a lot of the time. To show you how much, so these are the photos I just showed you on top. And then there's satellite images of vegetation cover. More red is more vegetation. So you can see in Harshaw, there's more red spread out all over the place. In Sonoita, the red is concentrated along this creek. So there's a very small region which has a lot of vegetation. And the last 2 are elevational maps. So that's a lot. The red is higher elevation, and there's a lot more elevational diversity at Harshaw than at Sonoita. So I use those daily energy expenditure values that I told you I just got from the doubly labeled water method. And this is all on one species, the broad-billed hummingbird at these sites. And I measured this at Harshaw Creek pre-monsoon and Harshaw Creek early monsoon, and the same at Sonoita. So the resources changed, and I wanted to know whether daily energy expenditure could change at these sites and these seasons. And it did. So Harshaw Creek has really low daily energy expenditure pre-monsoon compared to all the other sites. Here, individuals are black points, and colored points are individuals that I captured both before and after the rains had started. And you can see that even individuals are able to change the amount of energy they spend in a day. Sonoita Creek, post-monsoon, you'll notice is way higher than anything else. It hardly overlaps with either of the pre-monsoon conditions. And it doesn't overlap with the same site's pre-monsoon conditions either. So it's really interesting that daily energy expenditure can change. The size of the beaker can change. Okay, animations showing the size of the beaker can change. Okay, so daily energy expenditure is really variable. The next is, what is that variability coming from? Which component of their energy budget is changing so much that they can triple the amount of energy they spend in the population? So this is where I realized that I wanted to do the same thing for hummingbirds that I've been doing for myself. For about 2 years, I've been tracking what I spend time on. I've been building an activity budget for myself. And I sleep exactly 33%. of my day, my month, and my year, which is interesting and very healthy. I suggest you do the same. I spend only about 5%, which is not bad. I spend about an hour a day on average in exercise. And then the rest of it is just other daytime activities. And this is kind of what I wanted to find out for hummingbirds, both their time and their activity, their energy. How much of it are they spending in a day on these different components? And I'm able to club all these components into a few categories, which I'll show you. So this is kind of like looking inside the beaker and seeing what's filling it up, which components are filling that beaker up, and how variable are those components. So one way to look at daily energy expenditure is just a sum of the time times the energy. So the amount of time you spend on an activity and the energy you spend per unit time. So to construct an energy budget for that same species, the broad-billed hummingbird, this is again a 3-gram bird. It's something like this. You take daily energy expenditure from the W-labeled method. So it's an independent measure of how much energy they're spending in a day. And it's made up of basal metabolic costs, so just how much you need just to maintain your basic body functions at rest. Their thermoregulatory costs, because they generate heat like we do to maintain a constant body temperature. Their activity costs during the day, and their nighttime energy expenditure. So how much are they spending all night? And so these components fill up that beaker. Now, there have been 3 models proposed for how these different components relate to each other. And this is just how basal metabolic costs or the basic maintenance costs relate to everything else, or especially to the daytime behavior, activity costs. So the first model is the allocation model, that your daily energy expenditure is fixed, and within it, the components can change. So if you increase basal metabolic rates or basic maintenance costs, you have to decrease everything else to keep that total the same. The second is the independent model, which is when if you increase basal metabolic costs, they don't really have an effect, a correlational effect with the other components. The other components could increase or decrease independently. And the third is the performance model, which posits that if you increase basal metabolic rates, that kind of facilitates an increase in the other costs, and you're better performing, so you're able to spend more energy on other things. So this is just a little bit of background for what we'll be looking at later. So I went to construct an energy budget for these hummingbirds, and I really wish we could put Fitbits on them, but they're so small. There's no accelerometers with data and batteries. There's some people in the room who I'm talking to about this, but there's none that exist right now that can fit on hummingbirds. They would fall off. So instead, we use this incredible respirometry system, which can measure the amount of oxygen and carbon dioxide in your breath to see how much energy you're spending on a certain activity. And so I was able to use that method to calculate everything except for the activity costs. But if I'm able to estimate their basal metabolic costs, their thermoregulatory costs, and their nighttime energy expenditure, and I know daily energy expenditure, the only thing left is activity. And so I could model a bunch of different activity levels to see which best matched total daily energy expenditure. So this is a similar plot to what I showed you earlier, and the box plots are the same of the daily energy expenditure from the doubly labeled method. But here I'll be showing you my model values. So there's 4 different activity scenarios that I modeled. This is the percentage of their day spent hovering versus flying versus perching. So I had a really low activity scenario where they were spending 5% of their day hovering, 20% flying, and 75% perching. And then this more traditional scenario, which has been described in the literature before, of them only being active for a total of 30% of the day and perching for 70% of the day. And then 2 other much higher activity scenarios, up to 80% of their day spent active, flying or hovering, and only 20% perching. And what I found, so the colors are kind of the flip of the legend. The really high activity scenario was the only one that could explain energy expenditures in Sonoyta Creek post-monsoon. There were a bunch of them that could, because there was so much spread at Harshaw pre-monsoon, there was a bunch that could explain that, but not the high activity. And the other 2 fall kind of in between. So this is when I use the mean values per activity type. So I use mean hovering costs, mean perching, mean flying. I also allowed individual variation, kind of incorporated individual variation. So those got a lot wider. So they could be changing both the time they spend on an activity and the energy that they produced per unit time on that activity. But still, the only thing that can explain Sonoyta Creek post-monsoon is extremely high activity levels. And this has never been, hummingbirds are not thought to, like, there's no data that exists on saying that hummingbirds are able to be active for 80% of their day. You'll remember, I do exercise for 5% of my day, and I feel very accomplished when I do that. So 80% just seems like a whole lot, and that hasn't been described in hummingbirds before. To explain why their daily energy expenditure is changing so much, why are their activity costs changing so much, we can look to the landscape. So this is a plot of the log flowers versus, across different transects at these sites. And the numbers there are the raw flower values. So this is Harshaw Creek versus Sonoyta. And you can see that Harshaw, the elevationally, vegetationally diverse, the cooler one, has a lot more flowers than Sonoyta. You'll see that you won't see them because they're so small. The red dots are the post-monsoon or just after it starts raining flower abundances, and they're really low. And also the black dots are pre-monsoon. And Harshaw clearly has more than Sonoyta, and also there's more flowers pre-monsoon than post-monsoon. So I think what's going on here is really interesting. The hummingbirds are able to perch more when there's really clumped and dense resources. So their total activity costs are lower and their daily energy expenditure is lower. And then as resources start to decrease before the rains really set in and before flowers bloom in for real, they decrease their activity costs and decrease their energy expenditure. And then once the rains start, before the flowers bloom, resources are really scarce and not abundant at all. And they have to forage a lot. So they have to spend a lot of time getting from flower to flower, and they spend a lot more energy. How does this break up? So if you divide this into activity, nighttime energy, and thermoregulation plus basal metabolic costs, this is the percentage of the energy budget that they constitute. So the red points are the max values, the black are the mean, and the blue are the min. And you can see that activity is both the largest and the most variable component of the daily energy budget in this model. Thermoregulation and nighttime are variable, but they're much smaller. So when activity is really low, these components become more important, but otherwise activity is the main driver. So I'm active for about 5% of my day, and hummingbirds are spending, this is energy, hummingbirds are spending 22 to 84% of their daily energy on activity costs. So of these three models, clearly allocation isn't the right one for hummingbirds, that they are able to change the size of their beaker, they're able to change how much energy they spend in a day. And I think out of the two, of the independent and performance, I think the independent is more likely, because I don't think that the changes in basal metabolic rates are enough to explain the huge increases in total daily energy expenditures. Okay, so moving on to the last, but this is half of my dissertation, so not least at all, component of my dissertation. So I wanted to assess what they do at night. And you'll remember just now that I told you that nighttime energy expenditure wasn't that big a component. But if they're running at the rates that they do all day, they would die at night very often. So they're using energy really fast, they're not feeding at night, and they have limited energy stores. So the only way to be able to wake up in the morning is very often to use torpor. This is a hummingbird in torpor. This is very hard to actually find in the field. I wish it was this easy, but people do find them like this on their feeders and in their backyards sometimes. So this is a Dawn does not like showing this, but it's really hard to get a picture of hummingbird in torpor otherwise. So what is torpor? Endotherms like us, if we're maintaining a constant body temperature, there's a sweet spot of temperatures, outside air temperatures, that we don't need to generate heat to be at. So that's called the thermoneutral zone. And as it gets colder and colder, like this room sometimes, you have to spend more and more energy to maintain a constant body temperature. And if it gets warmer and warmer, you have to spend more and more energy to sweat or to somehow lose heat to maintain a constant body temperature. Hummingbirds, because if they had to spend so much energy, they would die. They can often use torpor by dropping their energy expenditure and their body temperature down. So as the night gets colder, they're able to spend less and less energy until they hit some minimum body temperature. And after that, they have to increase the amount of energy they spend to maintain that minimum body temperature. What's interesting is that they save different, so they save different amounts of energy depending on where they are along this red line. But also, torpor comes with some costs. And the costs aren't really known in birds, but in mammals, we know that hibernating animals or animals that are in torpor could not have immune function, they could face some effects of sleep deprivation, and they could be susceptible to predation. So these hummingbirds are completely useless when they're in torpor. You can shake them, you can make a lot of sound, and there's nothing they can do for 20 or 30 minutes. So you could easily get eaten if a predator finds you in that state. So maybe they don't all maximize torpor use all the time. Let me just go back. So the thing that most people have done with hummingbirds in the past is put them in a box in the lab, change the temperature, and see how much energy they're spending. And this is an interesting thing to generate plots like this, but it doesn't really tell us what affects torpor use in the field. So I went out to Ecuador and to Arizona, and I collected data on torpor use of these hummingbirds in the field under natural light and temperature conditions. And what I found was, first of all, that mass influences their probability of entering torpor. So the bigger the bird is, the less likely it is to enter torpor. And this makes sense because then their energy stores are probably allowing them to avoid torpor more. And bigger birds have more energy stores. I also found that this field thing, duration of torpor use, was much more important to nighttime energy expenditure than all the other components I considered. So this is a plot of nighttime energy expenditure corrected for mass in kilojoules and the duration of torpor in hours. And the longer they use torpor for, the less energy they spent in the overnight. So it didn't really depend where along that red line they were, how much energy they were saving per hour, as long as they used torpor for a long time. And this is something that you can't really find out in the lab. You don't know how long they're using torpor for under field conditions if you do this in the lab. So I think night length, how long the night is, and their energy stores are affecting when they enter torpor and how long they stay in it for. And that's the most important thing for nighttime energy expenditure. Okay, so I produced this graph, and then I went and collected some more data in the high elevation sites and in Arizona, and I found that there was something weird going on. There were some points over here, and there shouldn't be points over here. What's going on? Why would there be in between points? So there was something else happening. They weren't only, they were maximizing torpor use if you accounted for their mass and their, not really temperature, but some birds were maximizing torpor use. But I wanted to see what was happening in these in-between states. So here I started questioning sleep. What is sleep? I spend 33% of my days asleep, but we really don't know why. Why do humans, why do animals have to sleep so much? And to look at this, I'll show you these 4 kind of scenarios. One is when you're just asleep, this is body temperature as a function of the time of night, and the dashed black lines are ambient or outside air temperatures. So if we're asleep, we're usually maintaining that constant body temperature, maybe dropping it by 1 or 2 degrees Celsius in our sleep, and kind of keeping that for the whole night. We know that hummingbirds can do this. They can drop down into deep torpor. They're allowing the outside air to determine what their body's temperature is, down to that minimum body temperature, and they're saving a bunch of energy by doing that. Other birds, like some pigeons, for example, and some mammals as well, can use this shallower version of torpor, where they're dropping their body temperature down only by 4 or 5 degrees Celsius and saving some energy, but not like going into deep torpor. This scenario has never been described in birds before, where the same animal, the same species, the same individual, can use both shallow and deep torpor and regulate its body temperature and its energy expenditure at different levels. And this is what I was starting to see. So to really test if this was happening, I used this really fancy, like military grade thermal camera that Dawn has, which people put like, you can't take this out of the country because it's military protected. And I pointed it at these tiny little hummingbirds, which you can see over here. So that's the camera, and it's pointed at these hummingbirds. They're put in a plexiglass chamber outside, so they are experiencing natural light and temperature conditions. And it's covered with this little plexiglass sheet, this little plastic sheet. And we're able to lift the plastic sheet once the bird has gone to sleep and measure the actual surface temperatures of this bird all night. So what I found was that this blue-throated hummingbird, a large territorial species, normally stayed normothermic all night, meaning it maintained a high body temperature all night. So this is at midnight, at 2 a.m. and at 4 a.m. And the eye is the place to look in these images. These are thermal images because the eye has the least feather density, so you're able to see through to the skin the best. So the eye gives you the most accurate kind of estimate of what's going on inside the body. And these surface temperatures were maintained really high at about 32 degrees Celsius all night. These individuals, the black-chinned hummingbirds, which are about half the size of the blue-throats, they went into torpor a lot. And you can barely even see the bird because its body is same temperature as the outside air at about 15 degrees Celsius. So these are species, the hummingbirds in general have really high body temperatures of 41 degrees Celsius when they're normothermic. You'll see a lower temperature on the skin. But these birds are going down to 15 degrees Celsius at night. And then there's these magnificent Rivoli's hummingbirds, which very often used shallow torpor. And they were actually doing that intermediate state that we didn't know hummingbirds could do. They were maintaining their body temperature at about 26 degrees Celsius very often. Sorry, their surface temperatures at 26 degrees Celsius. So if you want to look at a plot of temperatures over the course of the night, this is from 8:10 p.m. to 5:35 a.m. These are the maximum surface temperatures on the bird, and these are ambient or outside air temperatures. And you can see that this individual had a high surface temperature at the beginning of the night, and then dropped down into this shallow state, where its surface temperature was 28 to 26 degrees Celsius. And then it also dropped down into deep torpor and went down to about 11 degrees Celsius, and then came back up into shallow, and then came back up into being monotonic at the end of the night. So it was using a range of strategies within the course of a single night. And I was able to make these really neat 3D plots. So this is the surface of the bird, that's its eye, and it's sitting on this wire mesh that we made so that they face the right way. And we're able to rotate those images and look at the distribution of surface temperatures across the bird. So that's the eye again, and here is the tail, and that's just a 0 point to calibrate these images. So if we look at the distribution of surface temperatures across the course of the night, when they're normothermic, their whole body's temperature is really high, and the eye is again the peak temperature. And then when they're in shallow, the whole body is much cooler. And these are all scaled to the same color scale. And in torpor, the whole bird is basically flat in this 3D plot because its whole body is a very similar low temperature. So to see whether these categories made sense, I plotted them and ran regression lines. So I found that the normothermic and shallow lines, so the top, this is surface temperature as a function of ambient temperature. Normothermic points are on the top, and then shallow, and then transitioning from these two to the deep are in the dark points, and the green are the deep torpor points. So I found that the normothermic and shallow lines had very similar slopes. The shallow had a lower intercept. So this is surface temperatures as a function of ambient temperature, mass, and then this is the intercept. And the intercept is lower, 4 degrees lower for the shallow points than the normothermic. And the slopes are very similar and very low of 0.11. The transition points are kind of really scattered. They're all over the place because the bird is dropping from the normothermy or shallow into deep torpor. And the deep torpor line has a really low intercept and a really high slope. So it's a really tight relationship, which makes a lot of sense because it's behaving like an ectotherm, like a lizard at this point. It's allowing the outside air to determine its body temperature. So it should have a really tight relationship with the outside air temperature. That's what's happening. And then at the individual level, so this is the smallest, the black-chinned hummingbird, blue-throated hummingbird, and the Rivoli's. And these are individuals. That's the surface temperature. And they used a range of strategies, which is really interesting. The smallest, the black-chinned hummingbird, I'll just take these pictures off. The black-chinned hummingbird was normothermic in those green points, sometimes dropped into shallow in the pink points, transition, and then always use deep topper every night. The blue-throated hummingbirds in the middle, the large territorial species, very often avoided deep topper, but it did sometimes use shallow topper. The magnificents were kind of all over the place. So like the Rivolis, the name changed, and I still haven't gotten over it. The Rivolis hummingbirds sometimes use deep topper, very often use shallow topper, and transition between the two. So to look at the proportion of time, are these species using these states for different proportions of time? I ran a model of the proportion of the night they spent in these different categories and tried to see whether species had an effect. And so that's the black-chinned hummingbird, the blue-throated, and the Rivolis in the same order as the previous slide. And you can see, so these are model values, but you can see that if I just plot percentage of the night spent in these different states, the black-chinned is spending most of its night either in deep topper or normothermic. The Rivoli spends the most time in shallow topper out of the three species. And the blue-throated hummingbird, as we'd expect, it's able to store more energy. Being a territorialist, it has all this exclusive access to resources before it goes to sleep. And it's able to store more energy, I think, and avoid going into topper. And if I model these, accounting for species and the category, it kind of makes them even out a bit, but the pattern still holds. So hummingbirds are able to use shallow and deep topper in the same night. And you might wonder why this is important. So I attended this hibernation symposium at a conference I just recently went to, and they're trying to think about how to make humans hibernate when they go to space. Because if you're going to space for a really long time, you don't want to have unlimited food stores on the space flight. You're limited by, you don't want it to weigh too much, the space thing, satellite, what's it called? Okay,
ship.
module, spaceship. So you don't want it to weigh too much, so maybe you want the humans to go into hibernation and not need much energy and oxygen. I think it would be really cool to see if there is a spectrum of topper use that's on the same spectrum as sleep. What kind of physiological processes are you turning off as you go down from one state into another? Where does sleep begin and where does topper? Where does sleep end and where does topper begin? And these are kind of really cool mechanisms that would be really neat to explore more. So this is the first time that I know of that this range of topper use has been described in birds, and I'm excited to see more come out of this. I also found that hummingbirds pee in the night, which I can't get enough of seeing these videos. And they also preen. They kind of ruffle their feathers. This bird, I think, is asleep. Its eyes are closed, and it's preening. So I'm convinced that there's some dreaming going on, but Dawn isn't sure if that's testable. But they do like strange twitchy things in their sleep, which I think might hint that there's some activity, brain activity, and that they're kind of doing more than we think in their sleep. And as a side project, I'm working with this field assistant of mine who's now doing a PhD in Canada. He put up a bunch of these thermal cameras at nests to see whether nesting female hummingbirds are using topper. Because I told you that there are costs of using topper. There could be predation. Something else could come and eat the female's eggs. So if they use topper, then that could be bad news for their babies. And they also have to keep their babies warm. So if they use topper, maybe that would prevent the delay kind of development. And he found that females so far are not using deep topper, but they might be using shallower topper. So that would be a really cool strategy for nesting females, for example, to use. And we're getting some really cool videos out of that work. So the hummingbird paradox. Hummingbirds do have an unusually high slope. It's not as high as we thought. It's not above 1. But I think this has really cool implications for what's going on at the cellular level, at the muscular level, and at a behavioral level. They're active for a lot of their time. A lot of their body is active for a lot of the time. And their daily energy expenditure is clearly very variable, at least in this species, in a bunch of species, actually, that the 12 or 13 species that I've studied overall. Their daytime activity isn't mostly perching all the time. It isn't as straightforward as we thought. And for people that keep hummingbirds in labs, for example, I think this has a lot of implications because they tend to get really fat if they're not very active. And that's bad news. They die, and you can't measure all the things that you think you're measuring if your hummingbird is really fat. So daytime activity is really variable. They're capable of much higher activity levels than we thought. And they seem to really quickly respond to the environmental conditions and the resource availability. They're able to change from being energy loss minimizers, which means that you sit most of the time and kind of cut your losses. You don't need to be active that much because there's so many resources available, to being energy gain maximizers, meaning they have to spend a lot of time and energy foraging and getting resources when the resources are scarce. And for their nighttime use, they seem to be very flexible in their use of topper, both in terms of their mass influencing whether they use topper or not. Temperature influences the depth of topper use, how deep they go along those red points on that curve. But especially in their use of these different levels of topper. And I think those could be on a continuum with sleep. I think this is also important in a bigger context because hummingbirds are important pollinators for hundreds of species in North and South America. And if their energy management gets difficult, for example, in extreme conditions, then a lot of these these plants that they pollinate could suffer as well. So the broader implications, I think, of this work are that one, hummingbirds have really flexible energy budgets. They seem to have very fine-scale energetic control and how much energy they spend and what they spend it on. And I think they have to because they have so little of a backup if something goes wrong. I think it's really useful to study. This is really difficult to do, but I think it's really useful to study topper and free-living hummingbirds. Exporting gases into Ecuador is really not easy to calibrate all these respiratory systems. But I think we've learned a lot. And there seems to be this continuum from sleep to topper in hummingbirds, and maybe that has implications for space hibernation. They are also able to adapt to environmental change for now. I don't know if that'll last. I don't know what the longer term consequences of having such flexible energy budgets are. The energy budgets I showed you are built only for males. So I don't know if you are able to be as flexible when you're a female and you also have to feed your chicks, for example. I don't know if you can sustain that kind of variability and that high energy budget you saw in Sonoita Creek post-monsoon, that last site, if you can sustain that across long periods of time. And very often basal metabolic rates are used as a proxy for daily energy expenditure in kind of global analyses of mammals or birds. But I don't think it's a good proxy because they seem to be completely unrelated to each other. So I think it's a very often used measure, and you have to be kind of careful if you're using it as a measure of. It is much easier to measure than daily energy expenditure, but I don't think it's a good proxy. With that, I want to thank all of these wonderful funding sources that I've had over the years. I want to highlight experiment.com. So if you're desperate for research money and no one's giving you any money, you can raise your own on this crowdfunded site. They funded, Don and I together have had 2 or 4. He had 2. I had 1 with my student of each $5,000 each funded. So we raised a lot of money. You have to work a lot at it, but you'll get money that way. I'm going to go to my acknowledgements. I'm going to do one of those. I know, I'm sorry. So I want to do this because I think I spent 6 years here. And it's not just a time that I wanted to get through. And I think you have to be aware that this is a time that you're here and you can learn so much. You can meet so many people. From being here, it's not just stop laughing at my about to cryness. I think you have to really be conscious of how you're spending your time. And there's so much you can gain from being here, and you have to just be open to it. So I think it's really useful to think about what impact you want to have. Can you make an impact here? How can you make it the best? And who do you want to surround yourself with? What experiences do you want to get? And I think once I started doing this, I gained so much more. So, so I collected a lot of data on myself. And I've heard sometimes, that's really scary. What if I find out that I'm not working at all? But I think you'd sometimes surprise yourself. You'd find that maybe there's some ways that you're being inefficient at working, but there's a lot of time that you are spending trying to work, and maybe you could optimize it better. So I think there are apps for this. You can go and collect data on yourself and see what you're spending your time on. maybe we can all pool our data together and I'll make like activity budgets to compare people. It can be anonymized. I want to thank all the hummingbirds that came into my nets. They're such a pain sometimes to catch, and some of them would sit on the nets and laugh at me. But the ones that I did catch, thank you to them because I got a lot of data from them. I want to thank my committee. Catherine, my advisor, has been incredible. She has funded so much of my work. She has spent so much of time sitting with me, literally side by side, trying to help me write. I hope that someday I will be able to write intelligible topic sentences. But thank you for all of the time that you spent on me. I want to thank Don. He's done so much. I don't think that I wouldn't have gotten a PhD without Don. He's welcomed me into his life and into science and really trained me to be a good physiologist. And I stayed in his house for months and played with his dog, and I think it's been an incredible time. I couldn't have asked for a better mentor. I want to thank Liliana because I've learned so much from her in the past few years, teaching with her and being an adoptee in her lab. She's incredible. She's able to do so many different things and manage it all. I want to thank Jeff for all the very interesting conversations we've had. I remember in my first or second year, there were some questions that you'd asked in colloquium, and I always thought that's exactly what I was going to ask. I think it's been really useful to have conversations with you over the past many years. I want to thank Heather also for being on my committee for the first few years. And I will someday look at how to do an accelerometer on hummingbirds as she suggested. I want to thank all the people who've helped me in the field. This has been an incredible effort, especially Anita Morales and Eric Everts, who are both doing masters and PhDs in Canada now. They've really run with the bird thing and stuck with it. And all of these other people in blue who have gone on to master's programs. And these two students, these Ecuadorian students, got this incredible Ecuadorian scholarship to do a graduate program in a bunch of really premier institutions all over the world. And so they're all going on to do really amazing things. These field sites are incredible. If you want to go hang out with Muse and be without internet for some time, I strongly suggest Santa Lucia. You learn so much and read a lot of books. So these are all my field people. I want to thank the people here, Melissa and Martha and Donna and Fumio, and all the faculty. I don't want to name every single one, but you're all so important. The Cram Lab, the Davos Lab, all the visitors to the labs, and the people I ran to crying when something didn't work. And my cohort, we almost made it. So close. So this is all the department and my cohort. And the lab, and all of my friends who've been with me from the beginning to the end. Some of them flew here to be with me today, so thank you. See you. We went to get sushi with some of them yesterday. That's why I was taking those embarrassing photos. I want to thank National Geographic. They've been more than a funding source. They've really helped me become a more well-rounded person and give good presentations, I hope. And they had a mentorship program, which was really useful. One of my leadership program people is here, Carolina. And I want to thank all the people who danced with me. It's dancing. This is not an insignificant portion of the time I spent. All that 5% is just dancing. So go out and find the things that make you happy and do them, because it really helps everything. These are the people who've been with me from the beginning. My school friends and my family. So I have two incredible great-grandmothers who I had the fortune to meet, and all of my grandparents, and we are able to do goofy things. These grandparents keep giving me national awards. They keep bestowing Indian national awards on me, like, oh my God, you traveled to so many places, you deserve a Padma Bhushan or something. And Prateek, we negotiated the slide down to one picture. I want to thank him for all the signs and everything else. My mom is an incredible person. She came down to Ecuador to visit me and spent a month in the field. And she dislocated her elbow in the Amazon. And then 2 days later, we were biking in the Galapagos, and she was snorkeling. I also want to thank my brother, who's extremely intelligent and does stand-up comedy. So go to Pittsburgh if you want to see that. I want to thank my dad, who passed away halfway through my PhD. He was an incredible person. And I think he would have been glad that I got my PhD. And my grandmother, who also passed away during my PhD. So we do science because this is the thing the student wrote in an essay. The scientific method is a long, never-ending cycle, and it's quite possibly impossible to ever know the exact way in which our world works. But as scientists, it's our duty to keep doing science through the use of scientific method, if not for anything for science's sake. And understanding is perhaps the meaning of human existence. So thank you to this student, because I think this this encapsulates why we are all here. And I'll take questions. Yeah.
I'm wondering what you know or what you can summarize about the ways in which both of your field regions, Arizona and Ecuador, are changing. And in the ecological indicators literature, there's a lot of talk about what makes a good indicator. And if hummingbirds are able to track environmental changes quickly and with some amount of precision, has there been any talk about using hummingbirds as indicators of maybe some of this change?
I think that's what we proposed, and that's what we set out to do with this NASA grant that funded a lot of the work, because hummingbirds are able to rely on these nectar resources on very short time scales, and if they fall through, then there's nothing that the hummingbirds can do, and they might die out. I think that there is a lot of potential for them to be indicators. I think we need to know more to define how quickly and what they're indicating. Yeah, so I think they are good indicators on a very short time scale, but they're so flexible that you have to be careful interpreting what they're indicating. How these environments are changing, I don't know. There's a lot of thought that the high elevations will become more and more important with changing climates, and that could certainly be the case in Ecuador. Some of these sites were above 3,000 meters elevation, and they could get warmer and warmer. But it's also interesting to me, Morgan Tingley came here a few months ago and talked about how there's actually more area in high elevations than we think there is. And so, like in the plateaus, it's not just mountain peaks that are really tiny, that like a hummingbird is perching on the top of a mountain, and there's a lot of space for them up there as well. So, yeah, I don't know how these species will be affected by climate change. Our hope was to kind of model that and see how these things would change with time. But I think there's so much that we don't know about how hummingbirds behave in the field now that we have to define first before we can start to do that.
I think at the end you mentioned your energy budget, they were all males. Was that true for like the TOPA experiments too?
It was true for the TOPA. The only thing it wasn't true for was for the daily energy expenditures with the doubly labeled thing, because we didn't want to keep hummingbirds, females, away from their nests. In Ecuador, we have no idea really when they breed. They could be breeding the whole year round. So we don't want to keep females away from their nests and affect fitness. So we only use males for everything except for the doubly labeled water. Yeah.
Is there anything? So on all your kind of results, it seemed like you did have individual data for it.
Yes.
You did have a lot of individual variation.
Yes.
So like who's going to shallow cover versus cover, or even that change in food post monsoon.
Yep.
There's one individual that was pretty much flat. Straight up.
Yep.
Do you have any? Is there anything you can speculate about? Is there anything you've observed about like individual differences, behavioral differences, like that you might be able to identify that would cause these? Do they look different when they're sleeping, or does anything happen between whenever there's such a deep focus and
I expected all of the really tiny ones, for example, to use deep topper all the time, and that's what I consistently found across the really tiny species. So I think among the larger ones, it's a bit of a I'm not sure what affects them because there's the Rivoli's hummingbird, which I think is just weird. Like there was no way we could predict what it did any time. It would sometimes just escape. So we had like the curse of the magnificence because it was such a difficult bird to understand. The blue-throated hummingbirds were more predictable. They're territorial. They have this kind of energy source that they can feed on in the evening and go to sleep with, and then avoid topper with. And so they tended to not use topper a lot. If they did, I'm not sure why. I tried to see whether how much energy they fed was what explained the differences, and I couldn't see a clear pattern. But Don has done some work in the past where he looked at the fat, and for example, if they have more fat stores, then they avoid topper more. So there seems to be some energy threshold that affects their topper use. Beyond that, because they're field animals, it's really hard to define all the individual things that could be different. And they were all adults as far as we could tell. So I don't think it's developmental stage, for example, that's affecting them. Yeah. Stephen.
So you make the case that they're really flexible because of their ability to adjust metabolism, but that really, and I can see that really works with regard to resources.
Right.
Right. And but with, say, climate change, a lot of the problem is with increasing temperatures. Whereas torpor is really about dealing with lower temperatures, right? And so, is that actually kind of a place where you could actually see? I don't know. Their internal temperatures may be so high this isn't such an issue in most places, but is there potentially a limit at the high end where they do become more like indicator species?
That's what I thought going in. So I tried to see if there was a difference in the tropical and the temperate species use of topper, because the sites that I measured topper at in Ecuador were mid-elevation cloud forest sites, where the average nighttime temperatures were 23, 26 degrees Celsius. So that's pretty warm. It's not all the way up to their thermoneutral zone where they'd avoid topper, but it's pretty warm. And the Arizona sites were down to like 5 degrees or 0 degrees Celsius sometimes at night. And both sites had a lot of topper use. It was more the mass that affected the use of topper than the temperatures. If you say that these sites are all going to warm by 3 degrees Celsius, these are the values you get for total nighttime energy expenditures. So at the Harshaw Creek site versus the Sonoyta Creek site, we had a lot of individual data on the same species. And so I tried to see whether what a 3 degrees Celsius rise in temperatures would do across those sites. And it changes where they are on that red part of the topper curve, but that really, I don't think, will affect the total amount of energy they're spending in a night if they use topper. So it would take a lot. It would take like...
Are those average numbers, or you're dealing with extreme conditions?
Of the temperatures?
Yeah.
So I don't have that plot here, but I know the range of temperatures at the site. And if you increase even the maximum temperatures of the night by 3 degrees Celsius, they would still be able to use topper. At the tropical sites, I wasn't in the low Amazon. I was in the mid-elevation. I wasn't the warmest they could possibly be at night. But it would have to increase by like 10 degrees Celsius at those cloud forest sites to get to the thermoneutral zone and really prevent topper use. So I think they'll adjust their topper use for now. But whether they can respond to really low resource availabilities, if that changes, I think that could be a quicker effect on their nighttime, on their energy management. Yeah.
What is the effect of nighttime temperatures on predation at night? Like, I just wonder if snakes are less active when it's super cold at night, or if that, a window of opportunity then for them to go into torpor with less risk?
So very little is known about hummingbird predation. It's really hard to find, topper predation in topper. It's really hard to find toppered birds in the wild. I always used to think that like larger animals or predators would be able to find them easily if they were in topper and eat them up. But if it's a heat-sensing snake, for example, it would be harder to detect a hummingbird in topper. And so it might have opposite effects depending on what the predation strategy is. those other physiological costs have really not been studied in birds, but I think it could be more about avoiding immune function decreases and sleep deprivation and things like that. Predation, there's so little known. If we could put trackers on them and find out how much they were predated, that would be easier. But I don't know. They roost in trees and branches, and I don't know how much they're predated. Yeah, please.
Is there anything known about, I guess, members only known for the deep torpor?
Mhm.
Is there anything known about which evolved first? Is it that deep torpor is sort of an extension of some kind of shallow torpor, or that shallow torpor is an extension of the transition period into deep torpor? Respectively?
I don't think people have tried to see, because I haven't seen Topper put. Well, it's been assessed kind of in a phylogenetic context, but there are only, I want to say, three families that can use deep topper: the swifts and hummingbirds, and nightjars, and then there's one or two other species in another clade. So there are about 42 species of birds that use deep topper at all of any form, out of the tens of thousands of bird species that exist. It hasn't been studied on a lot of them. We don't know whether others can use it, so it's hard to put it in a really base phylogenetic kind of context. I don't know which came first. I think looking at development, for example, when fledglings start to thermoregulate, when fledglings start to use topper, might be an interesting way of seeing how basal that might be. I don't know. I don't think it's been done in a phylogenetic context.
Are there any more questions?
Yeah, that's the question, get that picture. We'll watch that.
Well, if there are no more questions, then let's thank Anusha.